Thank you for that introduction, Ashley, and thank you, ReactConf, for having me here. Hold on, just going to unlock my screen here. So my name is Aurora. I'm a web developer coming all the way from Norway, and I work as a consultant at Inmeta in Oslo. And that's not Meta, but Inmeta, which is funny now, being surrounded here by all these Meta people. But anyway, I'm excited to be speaking today to teach you how to enhance your forms with React Server Components. And I'm going to be coding a simplified version of something that I've built for my current consultancy project, where I'm actively using RC, and it's working well for us. So let's look at the setup here. So I'm here in a message box component, which is an async server component, and it's asynchronously fetching data from the, excuse me, let me just present my setup first. This is now the Next.js app router, and I'm using Prisma as an ORM and a local database using SQLite and Tailwind. So the message box component is a server component and is async because it's asynchronously fetching data from the database with Prisma here. And it's mapping these to individual message display components. And this is also a server component because it's essentially just showing some UI here based on whether the user has written the message. And then there is a message input. And this is just a form that doesn't do anything. And I can just try it out. Doesn't do anything. So let's enhance this with React Server Components and React 19. And the goal will be to make this interactive while reducing the front-end complexity and minimizing the JS on the client. So let's start by making this form work. So I'm going to use React 19's extension of the form element to bind this to a server action. Excuse me, submit message. And this could be an action on the client, but since we're using server components, we can use a server action here. I'm going to make a new file for this. And this is going to be a server action, so we need the use server directive. And this essentially means that this function can now be called from anywhere, like from a client component, because it has a hidden post endpoint generated. So I'm going to export an async function called submit message, and it will take in a form data object here of type form data. And what this means is that each field inside this form will be submitted with its value in this form data. Yeah, pretty much that's it. And we can use that to submit to the database. So I'm going to create a message in the database with some data. And this is going to be have a content, which, let's do that later, which we can get the content value from the form data. I'm going to type this as a string for now. And then we need to pass a created by ID here to know who has created the message. So I need to pass additional arguments to my server action here. And there's a couple ways you can do this. You could do a .bind on a function to pass initial arguments to a function. Or you can use a hidden input field. So I'm going to do that here. And I'm just going to call it user ID. And now I will have this inside my form data object. So I'm just going to close this off and save and import my submit message server action. And let's see what happens now when I try to submit this form. And then refresh the page, and it's been submitted. But I don't want to manually refresh the page. So I'm going to use Next.js revalidate path to tell Next.js to purge the server component cache and regenerate this server component. And now let's try. I'm going to say, hey. And now it's submitting and updating the UI on its own. So just by doing that, I have now bound this form to an action. And this can, without JavaScript, call the server action and query or insert in my database. So if you remember Sam's talk yesterday, he had this initial setup of, excuse me, I'm going to reference that later. Anyway, but if I had used the onSubmit here, I would have had to wait for React to hydrate this form to be able to submit to the database. Where I'm using the action, I don't have to wait for that. But the scroll bar was like here after I submitted, and I would like it to automatically be at the bottom. So I'm going to go to my message box component here and replace the div with an automatic scroller. And this is a client component because it's using an effect to, with a mutation observer, listen for mutation events and automatically scroll to the bottom of the container. And this is a client component, but since it has the children property, or it could be any name, but I'm using the children property, this will now wrap server components. So I'm still rendering server components inside the automatic scroller. So let's just see if it works. It's scrolling to the bottom. And I can also look inside the DevTools here and see that there is no message display in this DevTools because that's still a server component, and only the automatic scroller is a client component. Yeah, this is messed up now. Is that OK? Yeah. So if I head back to my message input and the submit message server action, I've been typing this as strings. But I don't really want to do that because this is essentially untrusted input. I have no idea what's coming from the client here. So I'm going to use a runtime validator like Zod for that. And it will, at runtime, check that my data is of the type that I'm expecting it to be. So I'm going to get a result from that. And I'm going to say message schema. And I'm going to safely parse an object and move my object inside this. And then I can use the result to insert into my database. And then I need to handle the case where my validation failed. So if it's not a success, throw an error. I'm just going to say invalid message data here. So when I now comment out my client-side validation here and try to click the button, I will get an error. And you can handle that however you want, for example, with an error boundary. So I'm going to add an error boundary around the message input and wrap that. And it just has a fallback saying something went wrong. So now when I click this, not like that, with an empty invalid message here, the error boundary will render it for me. But I don't actually want to throw an error here. I would rather return something. So I'm going to return an object with a success flag and an error. And I can just say invalid message data, something like that, and a timestamp. And I'm going to need this later, and you will see why. So I'm going to make this timestamp. And if you, for example, want to server-side validate per field, you can also return the per field errors here and display those from the server. But I just have a single field. I don't need that here. And maybe you want to do something else on the server. Maybe you want to check that a user exists, query the database, something like that. So I'm going to get the messages for the current user and limit the amount of messages the user can send. So I'm going to say messages for user. And I have my get messages function here. I'm going to reuse that with the user ID. And if this now is, let's say, over 5, we'll return an error. User has reached the message limit. And then I can insert into my database. And in the case that this fails, I'll just let my error boundary handle that problem. And finally, I can return success true. So now I have some server-side logic here, and I need to get this to the message input component and to the user somehow. And I can do that with the React 19 hook use action state. Use action state. And it will take in a action or a function to call. And we're going to put the submit message there. And an initial state. And I'm just going to say success false. False. And this use action state can now return a generated component state, which will be equal to first the initial state, and then after the last return value of use action state, of the function inside use action state. And then it will return a wrapped action to call, and by convention, you should call that submit message action. And I can put this on my form. and use the state to display the error that the server is returning. Like that, and I have a couple problems still. First of all, this is now using a hook, and if you're going to use a hook, you need to tell the bundler that it should load the JS on the client for this. So I'm going to say use client. And I still have to fix an error here, because when you use action state, the action that is wrapping will receive an extra argument called, or it's a previous state. I'm going to call it previous state here, but I don't need that right now. I'm going to make a type for that really quickly. Oops. And the function will now return a promise of that state. And I've already made this state, so you don't, or this type, so you don't have to watch that. So now, let's see what happens. So it's still working here, hey, hey, and then when I hit my max message count, the error can be rendered in the component. So, yes. But I want to make this a little bit more interactive and not just render some text here. So instead of doing that, I'm going to use an effect to listen for the state change here. And if the state has an error, I'm going to do toast with this error. Excuse me, and this. And then I need the dependency array here, if I can type my curly brackets, which I'm not able to right now. There we go. And we also need it to depend on the timestamp so that it will rerun whenever the timestamp changes. I'm going to say state.timestamp. And let's just try it out. Hi, this time. And I get a toast now. So I don't actually need this span anymore, but instead of removing it, I can leave it as a no script fallback, so that if there is no JavaScript, I will still be able to see the error from the server. So now I only get a toast here. Yeah. Let's see, what's next? But when I'm submitting here and it's failing, my form is being cleared. And the reason for that is that with React 19, when you use an action and uncontrolled inputs, they will automatically be reset by React. And this is good because it kind of copies the MPA form submission behavior. And maybe you're used to using like reactive form, which essentially is making a like controlled component form state. Controlled form state. This is now just using an uncontrolled input, and we don't need to put any state for the value here. But maybe the user could have changed this input to make it submit, depending on the validation. So let's return also this value from the submit message function here, and just return the value that has been submitted. And what we can do is leave this as the default value of the input, so that if there's an error, it will be here the default value. So now when I say, hey, it won't be cleared for this error. And still, there's something to improve here because I'm using a local database and it's responding quickly, but in reality, when you do the round trip to the server and back, this could take a while. It could be kind of slow. So now when I click, I don't see any feedback right away. And maybe I'm like inputting something and it's not sending. I would be sending multiple by accident. But luckily, the use action state also returns a is pending, or a value that is equal to the pending state of the action that is wrapping. So now I can use this pending state, or pending Boolean, to disable my button. And maybe say something else here, like is pending sending. So let's just try that out. Now it's saying sending, being disabled as the server is, as we're waiting for the server here. And let me just increase the max messages here to 8 and try the non-failing version again. So it's sending, it's scrolling, resetting the form. And if you remember Sam's talk from yesterday when he was like doing this whole thing with, in the initial version of his code, with setting pending states and error states and all of that, the use action hook just simplifies that for me and handles everything. So this whole form actually works without JavaScript. So let's look at that for a second. So I'm going to just disable the JavaScript here and try it out. And it worked. I'm not getting the automatic scrolling, I'm not getting the feedback on the button, and I'm getting a full page refresh, but it's still fully functional. So let's just see that again. It's working. And one more time. Oops. And then I hit my max message count, and the no script fallback is rendered instead. So what we, oh yeah, we can clap for that. So what we've essentially been doing here is progressively enhancing this form, meaning ensuring all the basic functionality works and then adding things on top to increase the user experience or enhance the user experience for the users with these additional resources available. So let's say the user is on a slow device and is waiting for JavaScript to download, parse, execute, whatever. Could take a while. This form will now work before JavaScript is loaded and will ensure the hydration of the JS that we do want loads faster because we're weaving the server and the client together by using this automatic scroller. Hold on. So now, depending on the user situation, they will get a better user experience and always have a form that works. And if you don't have to write progressively enhanced forms. Depending on your product or whatever you're building, you can consider it and still use your React form and use server actions with that. That's all possible. But by using these more primitive features of the form component with React 19 and React Server components, we're able to do this now, which hasn't been so easy in React before. Unless maybe you were using Remix, in which case, good for you. But I actually have some more to show here, because I've been progressively enhancing this further. So let me just get rid of my code here and jump over to optimistic branch. Oops. And in this branch, I've not done a whole lot of changes, but I've made a messages component that's taking in messages from the server. And it's a use client component because it's using the React 19 hook use optimistic. And this hook will take in the state to show when no action is pending, which is the server messages. And it will define a update function, which is how the optimistic state is going to be updated. And the optimistic messages have an ascending true here. And this is pretty much the same, and I'm passing in my update function. And in the message input, I've added a onSubmit, so that if everything is well and hydration has completed, we can call the onSubmit instead of the action, and the action will function as a fallback. So now I'm inside the onSubmit, doing some stuff to reserve the progressive enhancement, and then adding the optimistic message with the data, and then awaiting the actual function or the actual action to update on the server. So let's see how that works. You can say, hey, hi, test. And as they're in their optimistic state, they resolve from the server with the truth, kind of. Once more, hi. So we get the optimistic first, and then the server state. And then I can keep going and keep sending until I hit my max message count, where the state from the server doesn't match my optimistic state, and it's automatically rolled back. Woo, right? And when it's failed, it's also rolling back here. So that's pretty much it for the demo. I hope you get excited about this stuff as well, like me. And the code for this is on my GitHub if you want to look at it. The optimistic update is in a branch. And thank you, ReactConf, for having me. Thank you.